James Garvey.
Thank you. Well, Scott, I've only got 12 minutes. Stop. It normally takes me like 2 or 3 years to research and write a book, and then like 9 hours for you to read it, for me to make a point. And so I've got 12 minutes, so I'm just going to go right at it. I think we're in the middle of a revolution in persuasion, a shift away from giving reasons for conclusions and sort of elevating evidence and paying attention to facts, and towards something else, something that operates outside of reason. The reason that we've made this shift, I think it's straightforward, is we've started studying things like deception and persuasion and influence for about the last 60 years, and we are extraordinarily good at it now. We're really good at creating attitude change in another human brain. Let me give you some examples from the bizarre end of contemporary persuasion research. Your, anybody's political views will tilt in the direction of sort of conservative views if you're asked about them in close proximity to a hand sanitizer. If you're sitting in a comfortable chair, your capacity to negotiate is compromised. You're more likely to believe what you hear, so I'm hoping those are nice and comfy. You'll also, if you are ushered to that chair and touched on the back by a woman, you're more likely to take risks. We believe things if they're spoken into our right ear more than if they're spoken into our left ear. We like very short words, small sentences, typically written on nice paper. And we'll tend to believe things that rhyme. We believe sentences that scan nicely. I know this thanks to a paper called Birds of a Feather Flock Conjointly. The question that needs to be asked is, what is this doing to us? We encounter several hundred, several thousand persuasive messages every day, and most of it consists in something other than good reasons, right? Sock puppeteering, nudging, framing, anchoring, message carpet bombing, message discipline. All of these things are how we're now persuaded. And I'll give you an example. I'll tell you a very short story, and I'll ask you a couple of questions. And I want you to try to think of an answer to this. Here's the story. Crime is a wild beast preying on the city of Addison. The crime rate in this once peaceful city has steadily increased over the past 3 years. In fact, these days it seems that crime is lurking in every neighborhood. In 2004, 46,177 crimes were reported, compared to more than 55,000 reported in 2007. The rise in violent crime is particularly alarming. In 2004, there were 330 murders in the city, and in 2007, there were over 500. So the question is, what should we do, in your opinion, what should we do about crime in the city of Addison? Think of an answer. So that story was told to two separate groups of people. One heard the story about crime being described as a beast lurking in the city. 75% of them thought about policing, incarceration, sending in the army. Just 25% thought about social reform, creating education and opportunities for the people who live in the city. If you heard a different version, another group heard a different version of that story where crime was described as a plague, a virus infecting the city. The number of people who thought about social reform nearly doubled to 44%. There's a corresponding drop in the number of people who thought about policing. Right, so this is framing. This is a framing effect. We don't really understand how framing works. It's thought, the authors of this study think that it's when you hear a certain metaphor or hear a certain word, that emphasizes some aspects of concept and not others. So your brain will think of sort of structurally consistent inferences. When you hear about a beast, you think about guns and cages. When you hear about a virus, you think about healing the whole thing. This is, unfortunately, this is the real power of spin. This works on us. Just 3% of the people in that study recognized that it was the metaphors that were leading them into the conclusion. Everyone else sort of cited the crime statistics, which were the same in both versions of the story. So this is how spin works, and it works on us. The man to think about in this context is a guy called Frank Luntz, who works in the States, and he advises conservative politicians. And he tells them to frame the debate so that you get the response that you want. So he advocates, for example, don't talk about immigrants, talk about undocumented aliens. And we hear things like that too, right? If you want to tilt people's views in a certain direction, maybe it's best not to talk about migrants. Maybe you should talk about border security. That'll do it. right? Because we have different reactions to these things. Think about your reaction to the word torture as opposed to enhanced interrogation technique, right? Or war as opposed to military action. This stuff works on us, and it's a way that we're being persuaded alongside all these other things like nudging. And it works. And it's really easy to scale up and change the opinions of a lot of people just by how you put language. And this is happening, I think, at the expense of things like reasons and arguments and carefully made points. So two questions. What is this doing to us as individuals? And the other question is, what is this doing to us as a people? What is this doing to us as a culture? A lot of studies show that these new sorts of persuasive techniques, particularly in advertising, make us more materialistic, less happy, more narcissistic. We feel less free. We're less inclined to help other people. We're sort of in it for ourselves. There's a woman called Ruth Grant who works on incentives, right? And an incentive is a way of getting someone to do something without giving them good reasons. It's a bribe, right? Give blood, we'll give you some money. Take this nuclear waste dump, we'll give you tax breaks. Take a plea bargain, right? And we'll give you a lesser sentence, that kind of thing. She argues that when people live in an incentivized environment, they become incentivizable creatures. We become more easily manipulable. We are more likely to go along with it when we're given money and not have better reasons for our actions. We become self-interested. Her example is if you give your kids some money to cut the grass, they're going to want some cash to do the washing up. Right? It makes us manipulable, these sorts of techniques. The second person I'd like to recommend to you is Martha Nussbaum, who talks about what this is doing to us as a people. Her interest is education. And in a book called Not for Profit, she writes that we're currently in a crisis of like global proportions, and it's a crisis of education. And what we're doing is we're creating, these are her words, generations of useful machines, not citizens who can think for themselves. Because what we're doing is we're not teaching the humanities so much anymore. That's a luxury. We're teaching vocational education. We're teaching people how to do jobs. And she thinks this is a bad mistake because that education that you give somebody in the humanities, that ability to argue, to see another person as a person with views up for consideration, right, rather than an enemy to go after, the ability to think critically, to spot fallacies, to see through sophistry, all of that, she says, is self-defense at the heart of people power, right? And when we lose that, we lose what it protects. And when history is going in a particular direction, and there's demagoguery on the rise and that sort of thing, these people who are well-educated and able to think for themselves are really, really valuable. They're little Socrateses, right? Socrates was the gadfly stinging the sluggish horse of democracy into action. People who can think for themselves are really valuable. They're much harder to manipulate, right? They're anti-authoritarian. And you have to wonder, I have to wonder, if some of this shift in persuasion is partly what's going on in the States with the rise of Donald Trump. I mean, put him in a room with people, with Socrates, with people who go to a philosophy festival, right? They'll rip him in half. Not only will they not take him seriously, they'll annihilate him. Is this kind of what's going on with Brexit? I was in Britain at the time. There were no good arguments. There were no good debates. There was appeals to emotion, appeals to authority, outright lies. And is this shift to post-truth politics part of this change in persuasion? Is it part of what's going on in other parts of Europe with the rise of the right? If you can think critically and carefully, wouldn't you undermine things like that rather than support them and go along with them? Anyway, Nussbaum, for her part, argues that what's needed is a sort of global change in education. And we've got to, right now, start shifting things, or it's going to stay this way and maybe get worse. I don't know how good, maybe it will. So I'll end with a personal question for you. You thought about what changes to persuasion do to us, to our character. I think it's probably bad news, makes us more selfish. But what does it do to us as a culture, as a people? Maybe it's behind our inability to talk to each other. Maybe it's behind polarization. Maybe it's behind all these other political changes. But I'm supposed to be talking about the value of persuasion. And I think that has something to do with where your beliefs come from. So I often wish I had a kind of God's eye view of the causal history of all of my beliefs. like a spider web going back to where I first came to think what I think about corporations, about politics, about how I ought to live my life, what I ought to do, what I think is right. And I wonder how much of that is my choice. I wonder how much of that is a self-conscious, careful decision on my part, and how much is something I've been framed into or nudged towards, and how much of that is not really mine, not really my belief. You can do worse than think about Bertrand Russell, who talks about the man who has, as he puts it, no tincture of philosophy. The person who just accepts uncritically the prejudices of his time and of his age, and of his nation. The person who just goes along with what other people think. And Russell sees in that kind of life a horror. He's terrified by that. Because if you don't live by the principles that you've accepted, that you've critically reflected on, the life you're living isn't your own. Right? You're living someone else's life. And there's something terrible about that for Russell. And I think he's right. And I think that's the value of persuasion. That's what matters. And it bothers me a lot. And I hope it bothers you too. And thank you.